It's an odd one. This, in the old days, just before the Second World War, 1938, 1939, this thing cost £5,000 to build, which was a fair bit of money back then, but it was still a cheap tank. All the design process for the Matilda 1 cost a grand total of £15,000. And this was what the British designed as what they called an infantry tank. This was a tank that was put together to help the infantry on the attack. Thick armour, because it had to go slowly with the infantry attacking prepared positions. Very thick armour, but very, very slow. Now you can see as it drives along there, two-man crew, drivers in the front, commander's got a Vickers machine gun in the turret, but nothing else. His radio is on the floor behind him. So when he actually has to use the radio, he can't operate the machine gun or look what he's up to. So it was a very basic crude vehicle. But this tank, the Matilda 1, and its sister tank, the Matilda 2, amazingly enough, they were the thing that started the Tiger program. Because Hitler read the reports of German 37mm anti-tank guns bouncing, their shells bouncing off the thick armour on these tanks in France in 1940, and Hitler starts the thing that's called the Tiger program. That's to get the Tiger into production, because Hitler says a German army has got to leap a generation in tank design. Massive gun, massively thick armour. Often we hear the story the Tiger started because of the Russian tanks that are met by the German army on the Eastern Front. If you actually look at the dates and the facts behind it, weirdly enough, it's little tanks like this that get the ball rolling. So that's the Matilda 1, British tank. And it gives an indication as well, 1940, that's what we were going off to fight in. Now the next tank coming onto the arena, very privileged to have this tank here today. It's now unique, it's the last one left in the world. This is a Valentine DD tank. And the Valentine's one of those tanks, sometimes we've heard the name, sounds a bit effeminate, doesn't it, calling it a Valentine, but actually it's a warrior god in Norse mythology. So Valentine was the name given by Vickers, who were the design parents of this vehicle just before the war. They built the Valentine on tried and tested components. The suspension, the engines had all been used in earlier model tanks, so it was actually very reliable. Not very thick armour. It was designed originally, again, as an infantry tank to support the infantry on the attack. But because we were so desperate for tanks after Dunkirk, we ended up using tanks like this in the role of a cruiser tank. In other words, faster tanks going out to meet and find the enemy on the battlefield rather than just breakthrough tanks with the infantry. Now this particular one has been restored by John Pearson and his family, and they've actually got the last remaining Valentine DD tank. DD, duplex drive, two ways you can drive it. And as it goes past, you may see at the rear, there's actually two propellers. That canvas that's around the side of the tank would go up by compressed air, it would be raised, held in place by struts, and then you drove off a landing craft into the sea, propellers would engage with the engine, and you swam ashore. Now, whoever went and said to the first crew, off you go off the landing craft on a 20-ton tank, you know, they really did have a tall order. But the guys trained on these tanks, they weren't actually used on D-Day itself. And John brought this tank down because yesterday, down the road from here at Studland, just down Studland Beach, looked after now by the National Trust, back in this time, way back in 1944, they did an exercise with the DD tanks. A number of them sunk in the high seas, and there was a memorial down there to the men who lost their lives. They didn't lose their lives in vain. We learned the lesson. On the British beaches, the DD tanks were launched very close inshore. The sea was rough, and they were very successful. And of course, you can see the Sherman tank inside the museum. Now, the other Valentine that's driving on now, that's actually a Mark 9. It's at the end of the Valentine story. A quarter of the tanks made by Britain in World War II were actually Valentines. About 2,000, some were made in Canada as well, 2,000 were sent across to the Russians. And even though they didn't think much of its gun, they liked the reliability of the Valentine. And this tank driving around now, this was one of the last ones produced, what they call a Mark 9. It's got a bigger gun. gun on. £6 a gun, about 57mm, that is, if you measure the hole at the end of the barrel, so more punch to it than the earlier two guns from. Unfortunately, because the gun was so big, they had to lose a crew member up in the turret. So you can only get two guys in the turret there, so the commanders want to load the gun as well as looking out for commanding. Not good at all. Good tank design tends to have three guys in the turret, commander obviously in charge, looking out for the enemy. Then you want a gunner, someone who's aiming the gun, looking for the targets, and a loader to load the gun. If you put it down to two guys, lots of trouble. Now, next tank coming on, another classic. This one, many of you will recognise. This is the Russian tank, the classic Russian tank of World War II, the T-34. And this particular version we're looking at was made later in the war with a bigger turret. Earlier in the war they had something called a 76mm gun, so it was a T-34/76. This one's a T-34/85. 85mm gun, that much more powerful, bigger, roomier cast turret. T-34 was considered by many rivaling for the best tank of the war. The Russians could make so many of them, and they were simple. They're reliable with the diesel engine they've got. They've got wide tracks to cover the ground. Don't forget that this time in Russia it's a dictatorship. Crew conditions, if you complain, because crew conditions in here are appalling, if you happen to complain about it, off to a penal battalion and you're quickly replaced. So a very, very effective vehicle. Sloped armour, you know about sloped armour of course. Then we do the sloped armour models. Produced. Of course, there's all the famous stories of them being driven literally from factories near Moscow straight to the front line, sometimes with some of the factory workers going along with them. Tremendously successful in the war, and of course lots of countries used them well into the 50s and 1960s. Some were being used in Bosnia into the 1990s. So that was a Russian one. Now we're going to see a classic German tank from earlier in the war. Germany went to war in 1939, almost ahead of the game for the German army. The German army had designed Panzer Is and Panzer IIs for training its troops on. The Panzer III, that's what's entering the arena now, and the Panzer IV was what they wanted to fight the war with. Unfortunately, they didn't really think they were going to be ready till about 1941. Hitler, as we know, jumps the gun. He's going in 1939. So they're actually using some of their training tanks in 1940, as well as tanks like this Panzer III. Now the Panzer III is a really good workhorse tank. It's reliable, it's improvable, and that's what the Germans were very clever as well. They got their tanks to the point where they could enlarge the armour protection or thicken the armour protection, and sometimes as well put bigger guns on the tank. We've got an earlier Panzer III inside the museum as well, with a short barrel 75mm that was captured, probably from a similar unit to our Tiger that was captured in North Africa. Now we've got coming along there, that's a Kettenkrad. The little thing there, people often think this is like a motorbike. It's not actually a motorbike, it's a tracked vehicle with a steering wheel at the front. In fact, when the driver of that vehicle turns the wheel, he's not actually, his steering wheel at the front there, or the steering bars, he's not actually turning the wheel to direct the vehicle. What that does is it then actually operates on the tracks, stopping one side so the other side keeps going and pushing the vehicle along. And it's one of these peculiar, slightly over-engineered German vehicles that was used mainly for towing guns, pulling supplies. It was issued to the German parachute regiments, and some were used on Crete. But after the Crete, the losses the Germans suffered on Crete, they never used their parachute forces again in that manner. So the Kettenkrads ended up being used for all sorts of things. You see them on airfields sometimes, towing aeroplanes, bringing supplies forward over particularly rough ground. very interesting vehicle, but rather typically over-engineered for what its function was. Very expensive, needle bearings, rubber tank pads, lots of technology that perhaps wasn't really necessary on such a small vehicle. Now that particular vehicle we think was, well, we know it was captured in North Africa. We've got photographs of that Kettenkrad actually in North Africa put next to our Tiger 131 when it was in an area where you could, Allied soldiers could come and inspect captured equipment. Someone painted on the side Baby Kate. Whether that was a girlfriend's name or something or other was painted on it. But it actually, this particular one had been captured earlier from a German paratrooper unit that was using it in North Africa. A lot of our German collection, of course, comes from North Africa because they were the tanks, when first captured, were brought back to the UK for evaluation, mainly at a place called Chertsey, just off the M3. And once they'd been evaluated, most of that collection of captured vehicles came to the Tank Museum in 1951, including, of course, the one you've already come to see today, Tiger 131. Now, if you haven't heard the story about Tiger 131, I don't know what you've been doing all your lives, but just to recap, this tank is on a hillside in Tunisia, knocking out British Churchill tanks from the 48th Royal Tank Regiment. I used to say to people, a lucky shot jammed beneath the turret and the hull until a veteran pointed out that was a very well-aimed shot. And you can see that battle damage when you get closer to the tank when it parks up. We've never been able to track down the actual crew of this tank, but it looks like they panicked and abandoned the vehicle because the turret wouldn't return. We don't know if any of them were wounded. There was battle damage on the tank, but it was the following day, it was on the battlefield, and the 48th Royal Tank Regiment were able to go up to it, knock out that jammed shell, and we in the West and the Allies have got our first fully intact Tiger tank. And again, you'll be able to have a closer look at it when it parks up. I'll just shut up for the moment so you can listen to that throaty engine noise of the Tiger driving around.
Good man.
Now that gun on the Tiger, 88mm across the hole at the end, a gun designed for knocking down aeroplanes from about 30,000 feet, so it had a huge amount of charge behind the round that comes out the end of the barrel, muzzle brake on the end of the barrel to capture some of those gases so that the barrel doesn't recoil and smash against the rear wall of the turret. Crew of 5 inside, 3 in the turret, commander, loader, and the gunner. 2 guys at the front, a driver if you're facing the tank on the right, a radio operator and bow gunner on the left. And we're going to park the tank up there as we bring a couple more on, and you'll be able to see it drive off the arena again in a short while, up to the back inside the museum so you can take a closer look at it. Tiger's running very well at the moment. Likely to be called the Fury, will be coming out and our Tiger is appearing in it. As you can see, Brad Pitt didn't knock it out. Right, when Britain got it right now coming on, the tank that's driving on there, that's the Centurion tank. And again, there'll be blokes in the audience and their dinky toy Centurion. That's the tank that Britain actually designed at the end of World War II in response to some of these bigger German tanks. The Mark I Centurion was sent out to Germany in May of 1945, and it just misses the battles at the end of the war by a couple of weeks. But it goes on to be a great tank, and one of the reasons it's such a good tank is it can be improved. Video. In the 1960s, they built this tank that's coming on now, the Leopard, and they went in a different decided that big, thick armour, like on the Tiger, is not going to protect you enough. They argued that speed was a better protection than thick armour plate. So they got a fantastic MTU diesel engine. You can hear it rumbling away there, very powerful. Put it inside the Leopard tank, relatively thin armour on the early Leopards, tremendously good gun. That's that British 105 gun they got off of us that you just saw in the Centurion. And as a combination, it became a brilliant tank. It's very low power. More armour protection, but they managed to keep most of that mobility up. So the later Leopards, they're not only fast, but they're actually big guns on them, 120mm now, and also extra levels of protection. People often say, did people learn lessons from the Tiger? Well, actually, one of the few things that the Leopard has in common with the Tiger, apart from a good gun on it, is actually the Leopard has a snorkel for wading rivers, just like the Tiger did. That's about the only thing that we can think of to use. Very mobile vehicle, as you can see. You can't do that in your car, can you? Actually turn on the spot. That's locking up a track, doing what they call a neutral turn, being able to move one way and the other way. Off the arena, and then give it about 5 or 10 minutes, if you can stand the wet weather, then we'll be driving the arena off. It'll go off the arena, up part of the Vehicle Conservation Centre, turn left at the top, along the road, and back into the museum at the far western end of the museum. So please, you're very welcome to go along and take photographs of it.
Get on there first. Look, a nice place to stop.